because where we definitely want to start is with a story that, I don't know about you, Chewy. I saw the story came out and I went, yeah, I've known this for a couple of years, because it's not a unique story to the world about dis and misinformation coming from a small number of people. But this is a report specifically that looks into what happened around Parliament grounds and what happened with a dozen people providing most of the mis and disinformation. Disinformation researcher Byron C. Clarke is going to join us. In fact, I'll bring Byron in now, and then we'll watch the setup to this article, and then we'll have a chat. Byron, good evening to you, mate. How are you?
Hey, good, thank you.
Hey, Byron.
Good to be with you, man. So look, what we'll do to start with is we'll just play this kind of 60 seconds, and that kind of sets up the whole story for us, and then let's have a chat. Everyone cool?
Yep.
Here we go. So this is the story as per, and I guess it was probably this morning because I see Maddie there on TVNZ Breakfast.
100 arrests and cleanup costs swelling to more than $1 million. The Wellington occupation was about vaccine mandates, but some in the protest push conspiracies, extremism and far-right ideology. Many say misinformation is the reason why. Fresh research from the Disinformation Project says 73% of that misinformation during the occupation came from only 12 individuals. The changing narrative of the protest boiling down to what the researchers call the Aotearoa dozen. During the protest, the highly utilised, unmoderated, alternative social media site Telegram grew by 100,000 people to more than 350,000 people. Over on Facebook, a page identified as a misinformation superspreader generated the first and second most engaged with Facebook posts in New Zealand. And on the 11th of February, videos that involved misinformation were viewed more than any content from mainstream media.
So there you go. There's the setup. Now, they called them the Aotearoa dozen, and the only reason they didn't call them the Disinformation dozen, as I said, how this feels familiar, is way back, a year, 18 months ago, 2021, it was reported out of the US that just 12 people are behind most vaccine hoaxes on social media, research shows. So this is not the same research. When I saw the TVNZ headline, I was like, yeah, we know this. We've heard this before, but that's a New Zealand specific amount of research. This one was the Disinformation dozen, produces 65% of the shares of anti-vaccine misinformation on social media platforms, says Imran Ahmed, who is the chief executive of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which identified the accounts. So, Byron, it's not a news story around the world, but it's sort of new to New Zealand. What do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, so I guess this report sort of showed some things that we'd all kind of suspected about the impact disinformation was having, and the fact that 73% of it is coming from, it's not 12 individuals as such, but 12 accounts. So some of them might be like a fake news outlet that has multiple people behind it, but these 12 sources, and it shows the impact, I guess, that a small number of people really working to propagate this disinformation can have, especially seeing those graphs there, the days where they were getting more engagement than the traditional mainstream media.
It is also a side point that for a long time we've been talking about how mainstream media is nowhere near as powerful as not necessarily independent media, but certainly social media, and shall we say viral movements from small groups. And when something catches on social media, it becomes far more powerful and popular than mainstream traditional news media outlets can. And I guess this just echoes and confirms all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've dabbled in looking at these Telegram channels and that sort of thing, and I guess one of the things that I noticed is the amount of sock puppet accounts. They'll essentially be having conversations with themselves to get this perception of a much bigger movement than there actually is. Do you think that that's sort of just massively spun out of their wildest dreams over this whole COVID conspiracy tangent? It seems to have drawn in so many groups that wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with each other, but they've latched onto this one thing.
Yeah, I was I was up in Palmerston North earlier this week because I was invited to speak at Massey University about the alt-right and about disinformation. And the metaphor I've started using, which I've got from a speech that Michael Wood gave in Parliament while the protest was happening outside, where he talked about there being a river of filth. Which is a powerful image, but I also think a good metaphor, because if you think of a river, it doesn't have a single source. There'll be a whole number of tributaries coming into that, and that's what we saw with the protest. We had, like the Destiny Church front group, Freedom and Rights Coalition, and then we had people associated with Counterspin Media, people associated with the New Conservatives, all these people who don't all agree with each other, and there's a whole lot of infighting and things, but they all sort of came together, these tributaries to the river of filth, and then we just get this torrent of disinformation and of anger, and that all erupted in Wellington over that 3-week period.
And Chewy, what you were saying is these different groups coming together, which is why I kind of had a bit of a sideways glance when they were talking about it was an anti-vaccine, anti-mandate protest, because it wasn't an anti-mandate protest. There was all sorts of causes there. And really the thing that bound them together was we hate the government and we want this government gone, and they're tyrannical. So whether it was, and I'm not actually saying there was abortion protests there, but whether it was like an abortion protest or a vaccine protest or a mandate protest, there was all these, they found a place to bring 10, 20, 5 different groups together and say, yeah, fuck you, government, for our reason. And it got sold as an anti-mandate protest, which it completely and clearly wasn't.
Yeah, and I think once those groups started building, and they're like, oh, we can't have these conversations on Twitter, we can't have these conversations on Facebook. There's a new platform. We're all going to Telegram, and the way that Telegram works is it just funneled people into these ideas or this space that people wouldn't have hung out in beforehand. Like, I mean, I know people here in Dunedin that were COVID as a hoax, anti-mandate, all of that sort of stuff, and they came into it from the healthy living, crystals, and peace and love sort of thing, and now they're hanging out in Telegram channels with avowed neo-Nazis. But they're like, oh no, we don't pay any attention to those views that person has, but we're all pulling in the same direction as this. But it's exposed them to these views. And if you don't believe this one thing that someone's telling you, then you might believe this other thing, and you just get led down the garden path a bit. And it's one of the things that I've always said is that there's nowhere near as many of these people as it looks like. One of my favorites, and he's one of yours as well, Byron, is Damien Dement.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And I'm sure that dude just rattles around on the internet having conversations with himself like 90% of the time.
What you're talking about, Chewy, is the concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it's something that we've heard and seen a lot. It's something that gets used in armed conflict. It was something that we got taught a lot about in the early 2000s with America going into, Iraq and that, and then arming people who were traditionally their enemies, but because they had a common enemy, they found some kind of simpatico between them. But what happens when you work with people, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, eventually you get to a point or you get to an issue where you disagree with that person. So these kinds of relationships are never long lasting, because after you go outside the bounds of what you're joined on, you conflict over the other 99 things that you're not joined on. Have we seen that at all in this, Byron? We have to admit that protest was very, very well attended with groups of people. They had that month after kind of re-protest, which kind of went, Hurr. But what's been you research this? What's been the follow-on from the protest amongst those sorts of Telegram, Facebook groups, those sorts of groups?
Yeah, well, I think we saw some infighting among the different groups pretty early on. Like even on on that first day of the protest, the groups like the Freedom and Rights Coalition were a bit more moderate and a bit more willing to, go and move their cars that they'd blocked the road with, and then there were more radical individuals like Calvin Alb of Counterspin, pushing for them, not to cooperate with police and be more extreme, and he at one point called on the military to stage a coup, which it's kind of a ridiculous fantasy, but sort of gives you an idea that there's more radical extreme sort of, and then there are the more moderate groups, and then more moderate too than say Freedom and Rights Coalition, a group like Voices for Freedom, who have some worrying politics and a worrying worldview, but not really in the same category as Counterspin. I think after the protest, they've loosely held that coalition together. Counterspin at the moment, they've managed to get their hands on a bus and found somebody willing to print it up with all the Counterspin logo and slogans and things, and they're driving around the country holding all these public meetings. So pretty soon the Disinformation mobile will be pulling up in your town. But I'm noticing at these meetings they're getting people to speak in each location, and they got Sue Gray in one of them, who's leading the Outdoors and Freedom Party, they're calling themselves now, because they've got to put the word freedom in there, so they've just changed that with the Electoral Commission. But then they've got Matt King, who's founded his new party he's speaking at another one. They had one meeting where they got Brad Flutie and Vinnie Eastwood to reconcile their differences, because they're two who have clashed before. So they're working at kind of keeping that coalition around and keeping people close together. But I think it could pretty easily fall apart. The other thing that I've observed since the protest, I mean, you'll see if you have a look at that report, and it was in the video at the start, just the enormous growth in followers of these groups on Telegram in particular. There's 100,000. The report also notes 88,000 new Instagram followers to some of the disinformation accounts on there. I think the people pushing this disinformation would have been euphoric at that time, just getting all this new audience. But that's plateaued now, and I think it'll probably continue to plateau, and hopefully some people will even drift away from it as they get pulled out of the rabbit hole by friends in Varnau who are saying, hey, come on, get out of this. What have you gotten yourself into?
Well, the other thing about, I don't think anyone can question that there was an element of anti-vaccine within that conversation, even if they were anti-mandate as well. I mean, with research and information coming out even today, 10% of people who have gotten COVID in the first wave are likely to suffer from long COVID. There's going to get to and that's a terrible, horrible, tragic number, but they will get to a point where even I don't know what you call them, the dis and misinformation people, the deniers, the whatever, are going to have someone in their life or know someone in their life that's having a serious impact from this ongoing global health issue. And I wonder if it's not even necessarily the people in the groups. It's not necessarily the Counterspin medias, but it's the one they're speaking to. They're speaking to the person, the uncle on Facebook, who is agreeing with them writing, but then his wife 6 months later is still suffering from long COVID. Then that will change his perspective. And of course, all of us are going, for fuck's sake, all you needed to be was on board at the start of this. And then perhaps, we don't know because it's a virus that can get anybody, but perhaps you would have had more of a chance for your wife, person X, not to be now suffering still 6 months after the fact. So I find it, people kind of tease and mock some of the anti-vaxxers. I'm desperately sad for them because I'm like, I don't want to see anyone go through this. I don't want to see anyone get long COVID. I want to see. I know that the death thing is not quite off the table, but it's hardly there at the moment. But the long COVID thing, 200,000 New Zealanders. They're talking about the next pandemic. It's not a pandemic because it's not an influx of illness, but the next major global, pandemic / health issue is probably going to be long COVID from people who have caught COVID in the current pandemic, and that could go on for years if COVID ever goes away.
I think it's quite difficult because some of these people are so jammed up in this echo chamber now, and it's really hard for the people on the sidelines. Like I've certainly had people in my life that I've watched disappear into this hole, and it's really hard to try and chip through this, because for
Yeah.
everything that you say to them, they've got all of their other internet friends all saying, well, of course he's saying that, here's all this proof. And it sounds very real. It sounds very much like there's a scientific study. It definitely sounds like there's some people with doctor in front of their name that are backing you up. And all you can be is gentle, and I struggle with that gentle part. There's only so much you can be having these conversations before you go, you know what, fuck it, you're on your own. I can't do this. And that sadness of getting to that point with someone is real tough at times.
Before we let you wrap up, Byron, because we're going to move on in a second, I'll just say the thing is, too, is there are people with doctors in front of their names who are sharing mis and disinformation. But what people need to remember is if you can identify 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 or even 100 doctors, let's say in the US, who are on the page where you are as an anti-vaxxer, are you aware there's 1 million doctors in the US? So if 100 are actually vocalizing and confirming your views, what about the other 999,900 doctors that don't? We can always find even a doctor, even a GP, even someone who's involved who will confirm your cognitive bias. But what I would say is go and listen to the other 99.99% and see what they say about it. Byron, why don't you wrap up for us if you've got anything else?
Yeah, I'll put a link to the report in the chat. I've been reading through it, and it's it's 29 pages, so it's quite lengthy. But there are there's a lot in there that I think is quite valuable, and I'd encourage people go and have a read of that, and it'll really give you some insight into what's happening in this space.
And look, just before you head off as well, we'll share where people can come and find you and have a look at it. But there is actually one more thing from the article of TVNZ. This is part of the TVNZ then went on to have a conversation with one of the people from the research. And this was a point that I thought we could mention as well. The Disinformation Project says people used COVID-19 disinformation like a Trojan horse, which is what we were talking about earlier with many arguments. Initially discussing disinformation, but quietly pushing their own ideas that go larger than the pandemic. COVID-19 was never the only end goal of those sharing and producing disinformation over the past 2 years. They have strong ideas on what New Zealand should look like. The original intent of the protest to audiences was the replacement of the replication of the convoy, and to protest vaccination and the idea of mandates and loss of jobs. While that narrative started the convoy, it did change during the occupation. So by the end, the narrative was around resistance to the state, government, and mainstream media with violent and misogynist language.
Yep.
So that's what the research has found. And I guess, Byron, I said to wrap up before, but if you want to add anything, this is sort of something you do. You've been researching the far right. You've been looking at these issues. Would you echo those? Is that what you've seen? Can you give us anything around that you've seen out there?
Yeah. I mean, I do this research in my spare time. Really, I work a day job, and while I am working on a book at the moment that'll be out next year, I still think of myself as a bit of an amateur, and so it's very easy to think, oh, maybe I'm becoming a bit conspiratorial myself, thinking about this stuff, and then to see something come out from a group like the Disinformation Project, who are doing this in such a methodical and a very academic way, and reading that and saying, yeah, okay, that's reflecting what I've observed just in my more amateur research. I mean, it really hammers it home that this is what's happening out there and online.
Excellent. Well, if people want to find out more about you, Byron, and what you do, byron.geek.nz, they can go there and they can check out some of your interviews and your YouTube channel, FAQs, articles, all in there as well, byron.geek.nz. Listen, dude, I know we've talked before, you and I have done a podcast before in general, but it's very cool to have you on this iteration of what we're doing, big hairy news. And not that it's about the facial hair, but I got to say, It kind of works for
Kind
me.
of is.
All right, dude. Thanks
right.
for joining us
Thank
today.
you.
Thanks for coming on board. We really appreciate it.
Cheers,
Thank you.
Byron.
All right.
Cheers.
See you. Bye.